Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Chana Daswata, the chairperson of the Geoffrey Bawa Trust, and I would like to warmly welcome you to this evening's talk. The Geoffrey Bawa Memorial Lecture is held annually on the 23rd of July to commemorate the great architect's birthday. This year, however, due to the prevailing situation in Sri Lanka, we have had to postpone it until now. Due to these circumstances, we have had to hold this event over Zoom, the third lecture in a row to have this format, which speaks volumes for the string of challenges and crises that the country has endured since 2018. We hope that Tatiana will be one day able to join us, and I thank her for having agreed to make the annual Bawa lecture this year. I would also like to thank Miles Young, who has supported the Memorial Lecture program for more than 15 years now. In the face of the challenges we face in this country, we know that there is much work to be done and the role of culture will be put to a test. At the Geoffrey Bawa Trust, we are committed to this work and will endeavour to question, to study and to share forms of cultural production as they relate to the arts, architecture, the environment and ecological studies in Sri Lanka and beyond. Thank you all for joining us across time zones for this evening's lecture. Our curator, Shari De Silva, will now introduce Tatiana. Over to you, Shari.
Thank you, Chana. I first came across Tatiana's work as a student of architecture when she was teaching advanced studios at Yale. Her studios, as I remember them over the years, explored issues around the city, around housing, and carried a striking sense of social responsibility, along with really mesmerizing drawings. So for me, it is really such a pleasure and honor to introduce Tatiana this evening. Born in Mexico City, Tatiana studied architecture and urbanism at the Universidad Iberoamericana. Prior to studying her eponymous firm, Tatiana Bilbao ESTUDIO, in 2004, she was an advisor in the Ministry of Development and Housing for Mexico City. Tatiana's practice pursues architecture through multidisciplinary perspectives, promoting a collective environment with staff from diverse disciplines, including architects, but also academics and model makers. Hand drawing and iterative models play an important role in the working method. The studio also seeks out collaborations between other architects, artists, economists, and local governments, which are seen as integral to each project. Teaching has also been vital to Tatiana's practice, and she holds a recurring position at Yale University School of Architecture and has taught at Harvard University, the AA in London, Columbia, Rice, University of Andres Bello in Chile, and Peter Behrens School of Art in Düsseldorf in Germany. Tatiana has been recognized with many awards, including the Tau Sigma Delta Gold Medal of 2020 and the Marcus Prize Award 2019, to name just a few. Before we hand over to Tatiana, I'd just like to welcome and remind our audience that her lecture will be followed by an opportunity to ask questions. So please drop any questions in the chat box as they arise. Thank you for joining, and thank you, Tatiana. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Chana and Shayari, but especially the Geoffrey Bawa Trust, because for me it's an honor to deliver the annual lecture. It is truly, certainly unfortunate that I cannot be there with you, but I wish that these conversations could at least enlighten a path on a difficult moment in your country. I don't think it's only a difficult moment in your country. I think it is a difficult moment in the world. Certainly, in your case, things are arriving to an extreme, but the problem is, I believe, the system we are living in. We slept one day, we arrived, we woke up the next morning, and everything had changed. We stayed for 2 years in such a strange time. We thought everything was going to change, but then we slept again, we woke up again, and everything still remains the same. For me, I think there is an important and interesting moment happening at this time, and think it's necessary that we address things completely differently, and we remind ourselves that we should not wake and just live the same. I think this is what Sri Lanka's did, and I hope this is an example for the future of endurance, of social fight, and I trust that things will not just remain to be the same in Sri Lanka, but that this social fight continues, and that things are starting really to get better for you and for the rest of us as well. I will share my screen. I do hope anyway to be able to be in Sri Lanka at some time in my life. I have I have read and studied a lot on the country. I regard it as one of the places that I really would like to know. But I'm still very glad that we have a link this way. In recent years, the city has become a popular conversation, especially in architecture culture. No? Citing Per Vittorio Aureli in his introductory essay for the book The City as a Project, we have grown familiar with the mantra, today more than half of the population live in cities. Nevertheless, this has not been enough to imagine the project of the city since at least half a century. For us architects, this even has become unthinkable. And it has become unthinkable because we put on top our excuse that it sounds impossible. No? It's impossible to imagine a city of the future. It is also kind of, nowadays we see it as even a colonizing act. But the truth is that we cannot intervene on what we call these abstract forces that are shaping the city. These abstract forces have been really determining how the city is. But we call them abstract, but they have nothing of abstract nor organic. Sometimes it's called the city develops organically. The city is really shaped by market forces. And these are the ones who are determining who can inhabit in them. Forces that more and more are expelling the majority to perpetuate capital and production. Coinciding again with Aureli, we need to really understand that nevertheless, this is the truth. Architecture is the one that finally determines the city. And we, for sure, then not have to forget that architecture is then surrendered completely to perpetuate the form of the actual city, which is that perpetuates capital and production. In a city, there are infinite cities, and more we need to think that the city cannot be definitely designed or thought by anyone. It is formed. It is formed by those infinite forms that are laid down in the city. The city is then, therefore, the sum of its parts. Every sidewalk, every lamp, every bench, but of course, every building forms it. So yes, we architects are shaping the cities for sure. The city is both the result of the necessity and desire. The cities exist because they are the place of gathering, of opportunity, of knowledge, of productivity, of cultural exchange, but primarily they exist because us human beings need each other to exist. The city that we live in today is the result, yes, as we said, of the society of production, the one that was built on carbon fossils, the one that it's called very clearly by Elisa Iturbe in her essay Architecture and the Death of Carbon Modernity, the era of energetic abundance. The physical form of the city has been since its beginning the results of the forms of production. And it has only changed fundamentally by the form of the energy that it's fueled with. Again, citing Elisa, it has had three fundamental forms. That city that was the nomad city, the city, the more settled city, the agriculture one, and the one we live today, the industrial city. In the last 200 years, the city has been the same, although obviously we see it in different shapes, progressing from the 18th century to the city of today. But it has in its roots and its formation, the base of being the city that is formed by the carbon form that Elisa describes very clearly. We have passed from the city, the city of the late 18th century and the early 19th century, a very polluted one, disorganized, let's say, to a one much more organized and mechanized in the beginning of the 20th, for the city, to the one determined by development and consumerism for the city. Nevertheless, this has been based on the same thing, based on the form of the use of energy, which is based on fossils, the carbon form, and it is definitely the city that is surrendered to that, to the form of production of today. The current pandemic is not causing the problems that the city faces. The pandemic exposed them and took advantage of them. Today, the new mantra then is how the new post-COVID city will be. Nevertheless, I think this is useless to think. I think it's urgent and necessary to understand what is the post-carbon city. And to me, this is called the city of care. To arrive there, there's no doubt we need to eliminate the use of carbon energy, but this is not enough, as well said by Maria Sherezade Giudici. To profoundly transform the city, we need to find new ways of living, but mostly new forms of social relationships. Definitely a new post-capitalist form. Almost 6 years ago, I was invited by a group of Cistercian monks to design a new Cistercian monastery in Brandenburg in Germany. This project has really transformed me, not only because I think this is the ultimate domestic space, but because it really shows how a place can hold the body to exist.
Buenos días. Oigan, vamos a vestirnos primero, ¿no?
Quiero más pera. Yo quiero más pera. Yo quiero más pera. Yo quiero más pera.
Ok, ahorita te
Yo quiero más pera. Yo quiero más pera.
¿Te quieres?
Mío.
Hay que coser.
Ya mi copa. Y a mí también se me cayeron muchos. De mi copa. Oye.
¿Cómo te fue? ¿Cómo te fue en la escuela?
Our domestic environment has been completely shaped by the fact that we're laying down in this industrial city surrendered to production. This is how we have then conformed our domestic space. And now we see the struggles of that. There's never a place for anyone to live. This project has definitely shown me many things, but one of the most important ones is that we really truly need to change the way we conceive how we live.
Termina de tu sándwich.
Tú te la di, mi amor.
Mari, ¿me puedes dar más
Mami,
fresas, por favor?
quiero algo dulce.
Ok, come algo.
¿Me la como?
No.
Allá.
Entonces, ese es el corazón y la van a semilla.
Niñitas.
Architecture really, in a monastery, understands how a body needs to be held. Of course, I'm not saying that we should live like monks, but definitely I think there are many things that we truly need to profoundly understand in order to progress and transgress into a city that holds our bodies to exist, rather than a city that only that is determined by the form of production that is the only way that our bodies are able to exist. We live in one of the most, in the moments where this fiction in our lives exists in its extreme. And it's the fact that to exist, we need to produce. But we have seemed to forgotten that to produce, we need to exist first. So we really need to focus on how our existence is possible in this planet. And I think that is what the monks do. They really have created a model, a typology for a possibility for a physical body to exist in order to live the life they have committed to, which is a spiritual life. And the typology holds the body exactly like that. It is incredibly interesting why all Cistercian monasteries are designed the same way, just adapted to the external physical conditions that the ground, specific ground allows. But it's really entrusted and composed in a way that it holds the body with its possibilities, its necessities, but also its rituals to live and its only purpose. And it's really interesting how it never forgets the fact that it's not only about the necessities of the physical body, but it is also about the rituals that allow that physical body to nurture itself for many different things. We definitely have arrived to define a path to go conceptually in this monastery, which for me is less interesting to share. But as I said, I think that the two truly interesting conceptions that I really take from this and that I have extrapolated to our whole entire work since I really was able to understand them are two concepts. First of all, I think that the understanding of the necessity of the other of a monk is something that in the production, the society of production, we have completely erased because we have surrendered the necessity of the other towards the necessity of capital and therefore of production. So in a monastery, the monks really understand that without the other member of the community, they're not able to exist physically. And to do that, they understand also that there needs to be a precise balance between that individual, that soul, that individual soul that needs to be, first of all, a strong one as individual, and then therefore social. The understanding is also very clearly made physical, metaphysical, and physical in the monastery. For the body to exist, it needs to be protected and it needs to be fed. The first layer of protection is the clothes we wear, and that in the monastery is the first layer of protection of the body, and it's understood as that, and this is why it has a very specific form. It is obviously a first form of identification to the other, so here is the link with the other. The cell is then the second layer of protection to that body and to that soul that needs to develop. That cell is connected to a cloister where all the other cells are connected to. That cloister is shared by the smaller community, the most intimate smaller community, but it is also a transgression point of connection with other parts of the monastery. Then the monks are able to progress to the next and more communal space, which is the refectory, the chapter room, the library, all the other rooms where there is a much more expanded connection to the other. And then this connects to the church, which is the place where it connects to the outer community in all. The time progresses in the monastery the same way these circles evolve. And it's really interesting that there's no erasure of these steps during the day in any way, to go out or to go in. You have to progress through all these stages, ritualistically speaking, but also physically speaking. In our cities of today, we are used to have these binary steps all the time. And therefore, we are erasing the possibility of these communities to knit together very much. In my sense and interpretation on this in our city, we really need spaces that progress from the individual to the collective in stages. We need to create this possibility of entrusted relationships by allowing them to happen in smaller spaces. We go from our most intimate space in the cities, we go from our most intimate space, the most inner cell. We open the door and we all of a sudden are thrown to the very big, massive collective. In there, we just have to fight in order to get money to feed ourselves, in order to exist and back again. The second thing that I think we have erased from the possibility of our spaces in the city is the necessity of having rituals to live. And this I'm going to explain much more in detail through the whole presentation. Because yes, we all do have to eat and we do all have to sleep, but we don't all do the same. But most importantly, we just not do it for the sake of sleeping or eating. We do it for the sake of nurturing ourselves. And by eating, the food brings also culture, brings history, brings love, brings feelings, brings sensations that also feed our own bodies. Our domestic environment and the way we are producing it has erased those possibilities in full. We have really tried to understand how to produce these two aspects in housing in several dimensions throughout our work the whole time. It is just that when I started working in the monastery, I realized and I put them into words. There was always for me this necessity of understanding how to create these circles of relationships that are entrusting and enabling possibilities beyond exchanges, economical or productive exchanges. We have explored this in many ways and in projects in order to understand how then architecture can become the platform for those things to happen. We were asked to do a house in Spain, which is obviously something that is not being able to be extrapolated as an example, because it's a house in a beautiful rural empty environment that has no, that it's a dream house. But anyway, what we were really trying to think here is how to make an architecture that erases all those prescribed notions and understandings that are never universal, that have been thought as being universally helpful for everybody, as creating spaces specifically to sleep, to eat, to cook, and to wash ourselves, but to allow those bodies really to be protected, but exist in the form that they need to exist by themselves. And this is something we cannot determine. Nobody else can determine how anybody else should inhabit this planet, although we have tried so much. But if you think of it, this is the ultimate act of colonization. So how can we create an architecture that becomes that platform? Because there is an impossibility for us to create something for anybody else. So in this case, in 2015, with this house, we were trying to do that. Well, to start, be honest, no? We architects cannot escape from defining aesthetically anything we do. Although it has been said, no, that in the modern times, the architect was looking for only functional aspect, and that aesthetics were left away and were erased. This is never true, because that is an aesthetic approach on itself. So being honest to that part is something that it's going architecture coming from one soul, being laid down in a ground to be used for anybody else. It's going to be thought by that soul, and it's going to be then it's going to have entitled aesthetic and entitled form and entitled a specific space, defined space. So we said, let's accept that. What we can definitely erase is what this needs to be used for. This was the first stages of understanding of that idea of architecture to become a platform. And this is why we all then say, okay, let's do an aesthetically attractive form for us, very subjectively defined only by us. And let's then this imposed it in the landscape. Find ways to find different relationships towards the landscape, allow these forms to have different relationships in this landscape, and then allow these shapes to be whatever. The problem became when we had to submit the plans for approval, because this house was to be at some point being built. Life can surprise us, and maybe it's going to be built at some point. But then we had to look for different ways of representation, because if we think how we represent the architecture is already determining how anybody should inhabit this place. So we were experimenting with this, which is never a plan, never a section, never a model, never a facade, because it's all at the same time. It's even little pieces of paper that you cannot see here, but they are by themselves. When they're folded, they become also models. It was difficult to represent what we wanted. We wanted that these modules could be determined by anybody to define how it's being used. At the end, we commissioned someone in the office to do this drawing, so definitely was the interpretation of that person. But we entrusted ourselves to the thought that this was never going to be showed to anybody else but the people who did the building permit. So people, when they arrive there, they can inhabit these places as they want. So it's not that a volume is a living room or a sleeping room, is that it can be anything. It can be all of the above or none of the above, and it can be inhabited in that way. Anyway, this was not built, so I don't know if this was if this experiment is something that can become a platform. It's obviously something that it's very experimental. Later on, we were asked in a similar way to design a house for a specific brief. That for me in the beginning was also strange, because the brief asked for the house for the new ways of life, and that was described as a house that could be used for living and working in the same space. This was 2017, so it was before the pandemic. Note that, already thinking on how home office could work. For me, it was really strange, because it was regarding the fact that we have lived and worked in the same space since ever, and we still do, even though the division is very marked. Because the only thing we don't do in the house in the cities, also, because anywhere else it is also even done there, is the productive or the economically productive labor inside the house. But the house is the place of the most important work, which is the reproductive labor. It's not recognized as labor, unfortunately, and this is a topic of a whole nother lecture, but it is the place where the most important labor is done, is the labor of reproduction and care of ourselves. So yes, for me, we have been living and working in the same space ever. Do we live and work and it's separate? I think it's the same thing. So second of all, yes, the productive labor, it's also been doing the same way through history, and probably only in urban environments, the last 200 years, this division has existed. So for me already, the brief was strangely very reductively addressing those issues. So we thought, okay, what is the house for the ways of living? Not the new ways of living, the ways of living. And we thought, well, how are these spaces and what we're going to do in this place? We thought of thinking much more in activities and emotions and crossing them with this chart we did. Then we extrapolated 6 spaces, because the brief described a house that had 6 different spaces, being very clearly defined as sleeping areas and eating areas and dining areas. And we decided to really think on 6 spaces, because that's what they wanted. Our 6 spaces were not defined on a specific activity that would be done there, but much more on what that the space, the definition of the space could promote. But for people would mean something and for others would mean different. We then did 6 collages to define those 6 spaces. We definitely understood very clearly, since we were conceiving those, that for anybody in the office, we described them in words first. We said, okay, we're going to do a space that it's promoting the connection with neighbors. It's a space that it's fluid, it's topographical, it's landscape, it's opening, it's for gathering. And then we started collaging it. The people that were in the team were bringing images of the meaning of those words, and they were completely different. And we already had a very strong internal discussion. Not only we had always realized that for everybody of us, things mean completely different notions, and they're described differently. But here we were really clearly experimenting with that and dealing with it in a design. Finally, we were able to agree after several discussions on those 6 images. We did these 6 images, and then we said, okay, now what? Now how do we do a house from there? We put them together, we traced them, and this is what came up. And then from here, we started shaping the house. We had to deliver the idea of the house to the people who asked for it. And we finally delivered this. I must say that I was very disappointed, because I thought we could have arrived to the same place with the brief that they gave us. A house for the new ways of life, with 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen, a living room, and voila, this was our design. That was it. I thought then the process was really interesting for us. We were experimenting on representation, we were experimenting on inclusion, on design from words and not specific definitions of functions, etc. So there were many things to rescue. A year passed when we were called to say that someone was interested to build this house in Germany. We were very surprised. This was for a specific plot, and the neighbors from this place wanted to build this house because they thought that it was fitting perfectly to their needs. And then I had a meeting with them. By the way, this house is under the process of starting construction, which is really interesting. I had the first meeting with them, and it was really interesting how they had completely interpret the house in their own terms. So yes, at the end, I was very happy that something we did. They really have, they said, this is perfect because the kitchen is exactly where we had conceived it. And we were like, okay, where was the kitchen? Because we never determined that. And they imagined the kitchen exactly in the completely opposite place where I would have imagined it. So this for me was already something which we really thought it was a provocation and a start of a thought. We had before designed a design strategy for a program in Mexico for housing that could be built autonomously in many different parts of the country. This was a governmental program called Vivienda Popular. Popular housing is the translation, but that's not the correct exact term. But it's house that could be built by anyone, anywhere. For us was a difficult term because obviously, as I said, generalizing how we live, it's impossible. In Mexico, we had 67 different types of cultures, which are recognized by the government. In truth, they're not recognized because they're not allowed to have their own ways of living and producing as they have done for centuries. But anyway, that is also a subject for another full lecture. But we thought, well, maybe we allow this to be a strategy and not a specific design of modules of spaces that can be built differently, can be accommodated differently, and can accommodate then therefore different situations. We really thought of it as I said, as a strategy that could hold also a house described by the law, because these needed to follow the law and the codes, but could be interpreted as anyone lived it. So yes, they needed to have 2 rooms and a bathroom and a kitchen. But we thought maybe if we don't specifically interested like that and do more generic spaces, these could be interpreted in different ways. So instead of a room, it could be defined as a productive space, but also as a workshop, but also as a grain storage, but also as a gathering place, but also as a room, but also as a kitchen. So we really wanted a strategy that would allow much more ways of interpretations, and we were able to build these houses in different ways. At least we really knew that the people could transform easily the space in many ways, and we already saw it in the houses we built. We then took further the strategy, and we proposed for another housing solution that the government wanted to apply, even building only modules, and building only the modules, and the people could arrange them in many different ways. So giving the technical advice on how to build these modules to be them interpreted in many ways, formed and conformed within a unit in different possibilities, because also by the way we're producing housing, we're determining who can live there, who can inhabit these places. And normally that is defined for a heteropatriarchal family with 2 kids. And that's the whole housing market in the world is being, determined by that form of inhabiting. Nevertheless, that's not the way that socially we are arranged, that probably in the world arrives to 50% of the people is arranged that way. But the rest of us don't live that way. So how can we determine a unit as a specific place for who to inhabit? So we think a unit should be determined even by the dwellers. So if you think of modules of inhabitation, those could be arranged differently and could then form different social forms, allow different social forms of communities that are formed differently anywhere. We also thought that then, in this case, not surrendered by production is surrendered to a city that is of community and of care. We then have proposed these in other ways, in this case in St. Louis, Missouri, which in this city, the city is completely determined by these single houses, determined by the heteropatriarchal family that are determined for existing within the city of production, because the houses are, you know, connected to the streets that then are efficiently laid down to arrive efficiently to the places of work. So we were able to design a whole block, and we were trying to blur that by understanding that the same block that is determined by that, by laid down by that city, could be rearranged in order to hold a community of houses that share things in different ways. Yes, there is a private space, very private one, for the person who wants to exist there in the form they want to exist there. But then there is different blurred shared spaces that are creating pockets of relationships that in a way can allow 4 units to share things, other 3 units to share a different garden, the whole block to share more communal spaces like an open area to swim or to do exercise, or a space for even the community at large, which is a park that opens to anybody else. Pockets of spaces that allow different things to happen in smaller scales, individually and not so individually, and not only communally, and spaces that can allow for different ways to progress, play, rest, and things, but in much more open and trusted ways. We have also thought how to translate this in a much more collective way. It was hard to imagine that, as I said, one mind can determine how anybody can live. So I've been trying to think, how can we do this collectively? I've, for example, was entrusted to design this first block for a very huge master plan of a city that has a power line that it's going to be removed. And so we were thinking how to create the possibility in the law, because this was going to be translated to become how the space could be used. A space could be, you know, becoming something that promotes a communal living rather than productivity or an economical ready travel area for the city. Then we said, okay, this is for sure something we cannot imagine by ourselves alone. So we invited architects from different parts of the world who already were thinking how to do this in order to design this first block. We all went there, we all spoke about it, we sat on the table, we draw a lot of things. We thought maybe drawing a common ground and allowing different things to exist on the top and arranging them differently could help. We don't know, because this has not been built as well, but we thought this could be a start. In other senses, we are also experimenting vertically in much more collective spaces and trying to think what are those things that allow, first of all, different forms of social relationships to exist. Second of all, different stages of social relationships to happen within the compound. Third of all, allowing those aspects of life that are much more ritualistic rather than functional to coexist and to allow to promote a total different environment. In this case, it's collective housing for 150 units. We really wanted to understand how we could erase and blur the notion of the 150 and you know, understand it much more in a sequence of 1 unit plus 4 units coexisting with 20 others, and then with 40, and then with 50, and then with 150. How can then, by kind of transgressing the possibility of discovering the place by having connections in different ways, not the efficient way of using one elevator, one staircase, one hallway to arrive to the place, but really allowing for different moments of encounters, of laying down aspects of life that are mundane and that had been erased from the domestic environment that we live. Much more thinking, how can we allow those things that do happen in cities, and this is what the city it gets its richness of, these friction spaces, these spaces that are not determined, these spaces that are created by different people, inhabited in different ways, and are just not determined by it. And we designed finally this community, this building, this place is now under construction. Let's hope that the reduction of the construction and the reality doesn't arrive there. And let's see how this experiment progresses into the future. We have tried to do this, as I said, in many ways and in several ways, both in the horizontal realm and in the vertical realm. We have really experimented with it in terms of how to create the possibilities of habitats and communities to really respect the history that was there, but entrusted with a new possibility. This is in San Francisco, and how to really combine the necessity, the infrastructural necessity of a community, but also the social necessity of the most important part of the community. In this case, it was a former power plant that gave power to the whole city of San Francisco, but also oppressed very much the community living around, because it polluted it. It really prevented for anything else interesting to happen, because the pollution would definitely prevent anything to expand to this place. It prevented the community to have a relationship to the bay, because the plant had it completely, and the community fought for it. So the community fought legally for it. There was a lawsuit that erased the possibility of the power plant to continue to exist. Then, long story short, we were able to arrive, and we were commissioned to take out the substation that remained there, that was allowed to remain there because it's necessary to provide the energy there, and to think what could be of use of this place. So the first thing we did is design the new substation in order to really remove the substation from the plot. We really, what we wanted is to create, yes, a specific infrastructural place for these machines to work, but we wanted to even transform that only as the icon of the place, as the remembrance of the past, but also as the laying down of the future of this area. So we gain a very communal space that was not described by the brief, that actually they didn't want us to do, in order to mark the first bastion of, yes, this industrial infrastructural necessity, building necessary for the place, but also the first one for the community to gather and open. And then think what can still happen. How can we knit the community towards the bay? How can we think of this place as the future, where it's going to be also floodings, because the sea is going to rise? So these exactly are the places who are entrusting, and many other aspects that for us were important to really understand how to produce a habitat, and not only a space that works and it's readable for either the company or either the real estate market. We are starting the construction of this substation. The rest of the project is yet halted. So let's see when finally this is done, what will happen in this community. We have started to pose questions. This was exhibited in the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art in the MoMA with that question: what is what you, the community, want in this place, and not determined by us. I think that I have been focusing in this lecture to the buildings that we have entrusted to kind of transgress the possibility of the city that we live in today, in order to think what is, finally the city that we should be thinking on living and inhabiting in the future. And with this, I'm going to wrap up, because I really would like to open this floor for questions and a little bit of a discussion if there's still more time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tatiana. That was really wonderful. And I think we're absolutely right that the moment here is one where we're very much thinking about our relationship with individuals, but also as communities in a city. And I think you've given us lots to think about. We do have a couple of questions, so I'm going to hop to those. The first says, is architecture mostly inspired by religion and culture?
I mean, for sure, it's a representation of our culture, which is formed by our forms of belief, which is a religion, no? And that is the representation that it is. It should be exactly as that, but unfortunately, it has been really shaped, by the power and the imposition that can make as an effect. So I think that is definitely our responsibility to understand how to deal with this, because in a way, only thought as a representation and done by as it becomes, a powerful act. So how can we use that power instead of by doing it as an imposition, by doing it really as a platform for anybody to really be able to live in it, at the end. I think that if we think on, as I said in the beginning, as that architecture, although in its more pure form, done by us with our hands, with the earth we have around, it is an act, an act of colonization, at least on the land that we are doing it. But there is ways of colonizing that land, and I think that then this is exactly the way we have to think of it. The way of not colonizing that land is not doing anything, but us humans need a roof to exist. We cannot exist only in the open grounds. And we have proved that the caves naturally existing are not those who provide us the possibility of the platform that we need to evolve, because we are very complex human beings. So how can we, understand the basic necessities our own bodies have? The fact that creates an imposition to the land that we live in, and how can we do it in a much more harmonical way in order to belong to that ecosystem and not to be imposing anything and erasing anything from that ecosystem? It's a hard question. It's those hard questions that we have to ask ourselves. And I'm not free of those acts of colonization, of exploitation, of discrimination. I've done it throughout my career and only by my existence. But by acknowledging them, I'm much more aware, and hopefully I'm able to open much more channels in order to erase them than the other way around.
Thanks, Tatiana. I think the next question it's a bit longer. They say, thank you so much for the lecture and the beautiful images. As you design these multiple ways of living, can you develop on how they're informed by ways of living that you have observed in existing communities? And is the goal to design for different ways of living that you have observed and learned from, or design diffuse space where any way of living can inhabit and create autonomy?
Yeah, I think it needs to be created autonomies because, as I said, we're never going to be able to interpret ourselves or by observing. We observe always with our own filters. We do and we think with our own personalities and ways of existing. It's as you know, it's as obvious. I always say it is as obvious as I always have thought, how can a man be a gynecologist? I mean, they don't know what a colic, a menstrual pain is. They don't know it. And I'm sorry, yeah, they might be really empathic. They have heard it 1,000 times, but if they have not experienced it, how can they really treat someone else, you know? It's not only by observing, it's, you know, by experimenting. And yes, even though I have menstrual pains, that doesn't mean that I can feel what you feel when you have them. So I could be closer, it could be easier to talk about it, but it's still your own experience, what it is. So how can we discuss this in order to allow your own experience to be able to exist? For me is the key question, you know, because in the beginning of my career, I was always thinking that I needed to become the other to design. For me, it was very hard. For me, it was actually, I have to confess, I've been confessing this the last years because I realized that when I finished school, I thought that I was completely incapable of doing architecture. I thought I was kind of had not learned anything in school. I really saw everybody very confident on doing architecture. I wasn't. I was like, oops, I didn't learn anything in school. I thought it was my fault. And then little by little, I understood that it was much more than an insecurity and uncomfortability. I was not comfortable with the idea that I needed to design anything for anybody else. I thought I never had the tools. And as I said before, I thought I didn't have them because I didn't learn them correctly. And then I understood I didn't have them because nobody has them. And then I need to become the other to design. But then I realized this is completely impossible. It's unimaginable. You cannot become the other to design because you're never the other. That's an impossibility. Levinas told us very clearly that. So how can then, with that impossibility, then you can do, you know, and enable things that others could benefit from. So for me, is that, you know, by understanding that, first of all, you don't have the answer, you don't have the tools because you are not the other, but then you can be empathetically enough to create platforms for that other to create their own form and their own possibility to exist.
Thanks, Tatiana. We have quite a few questions. There's a really interesting one on touching on, I think, your relationship with also urban design and planning. And the question is, as an architect, we also need to understand urban planning and its code. And I think you would have a very interesting response to that.
But what was the question? This one I didn't understand.
To understand urban planning and its code.
Yeah, well, I think that what we need to understand definitely is that every act we do in the city or in any place, it's creating the city. No, it's the sum of those acts collectively that it's forming it. So I think it's our own responsibility to understand how to communicate towards those other elements that exist, because the sum of it is going to create the environment, you know? So it's not only about our individual building and how this looks and how this, you know, reflects and how this opens or closes or whatever. It is what the relationships that enables and forms and produces with the others. That is the importance of it, you know? And I think we have not seen like that, or rather we have seen it as we need to design every single line of it, or we just think of our own little building, right? This is how urban and architecture is seen. Well, I think it's neither of the two. It's the sum of the two that creates finally the city. So we need to be there. And the second aspect that I really truly believe is that the code in which we have to believe is that this cannot be thought by some individuals is that this is done by all of us. So how can we then, I really acknowledge that the definition that it's finally done by all of us and it's needed to be done and thought by all of us. It's for me by thinking that me with the sum of you, with the sum of the other, with the sum of the next one is what it does it. So how me is going to be placed there in respect to that is what we need to be thinking. That is for me the code.
If we might switch to a question on research, we have someone saying, I really appreciate the research and design process that you're meticulously following. What are the timelines like on your projects? How long is spent on research and design before you move to construction? And additionally, in your research, do you collaborate with professionals from other fields to inform your research? And if I might add a little question to that, it would be the relationship between the aesthetics of the research and the aesthetics of the outcome.
Yeah, so this is a very interesting question which has no answer because it is never linear in our office. It's never a process that it's able to be described. It is always its own process. It is always its own situation and therefore its own process. So first of all, I think that the research never ends from the beginning even to the continuation of life of that building that we did. And I hope the evolution never does as well, I really like to think that our architecture can evolve with time, with its inhabitants and with its possibilities, since it's coming from the mind towards the ground and ad infinitum. And I think that second of all, I think that the problem is that about defining the process and trying to generalize the process is never being able to do that. The same is never able anywhere in any point. And I think that is exactly the problem. By giving recipes on how things should be done, we are killing the possibility of really things to exist and happen in the way we are. We are completely diverse individuals. All of us, the 7 billion people who live in this planet, are completely different individuals. And yes, we do share things and we have similarities and we have shared necessities. And we need the other to exist and to have them and to fulfill them. But that doesn't mean we can generalize anything. As I said, the menstrual pains that I have are completely different from those who you have. Might be that Advil works for the two of us, but they're different. So how can we really respect those differences? For me, that is the very big question right now today that we all should be asking. How can we create an environment that respects the differences that we all live in, and not how we continue to promote the similarities in order to impose a system that tries to flatten everything that we do and we are.
Thank you. Maybe this can be our last question. We have someone saying, thank you for your always beautiful, provocative work. Sri Lanka has recently seen the power of the collective to hopefully transform the political environment. Can you talk a little bit further about the agency of the architect today and in the future? If, as you describe, architecture is a platform and potentially a colonizing act, who or what is the architect, and by extension, what is architecture broadly? Thanks for that question.
This is a core question. This is something that I have been questioning myself my whole career, but much more importantly today. And I think that, as I said, there is a necessity of us living in a built environment, because as I explained before, we are natural beings that cannot exist in the wilderness by itself. We do need this built environment for several natural and social reasons. And so how can we then create the possibility of this to be an act that is done, but in a much more broad, collective, horizontal way than it has been taken into these last centuries in our existence? I don't know the answer. I mean, I really think that there is a necessity of searching what is the architecture of the future, the architect of the future, what is the agency of the architecture. And for me, a little bit of what I describe are the things that I am questioning right now. So yes, it is need to be thought, think, discuss, and certainly much more and broaden, in its own definition very much. I think architect should be erased, and architecture should be rethought for sure. If that's an answer to an unthinkable question. Answer a question.
Thank you. Thank you for your words. And I think for these questions also, which we must all carry with us. And I hope that this is the beginning of the conversation, and hopefully we will be able to continue it in person in Sri Lanka. Thank you again, yes. Thank you again for joining us. I know it's very early for you, and for all of you who, so many of you who streamed in today. And this recording will also be on YouTube if you want to watch it again.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for very interesting questions.
Bye.